Okay, welcome back, everybody. Thank you for returning. We have a fun-filled, as ever, class planned for today. In the first part, I will lecture a bit about architecture. Last week, we talked about Richard Saul Wurman's conception of information architecture, and my belief is that it leads us into a way of talking about architecture, and that's what we're going to be doing today. So in the first part, I will talk a bit about that. In the second part, I'm very excited. We have a brick and mortar architect, Paul Daniels, coming to talk with us a bit and then lead us on what he called in an email exchange with me an architecture parade. So those of you who want to, if you don't want to go outside, I don't blame you. You are welcome to stay here, and there's a plan B way of doing this, which is to look at pictures of the buildings on this block and ask some of the questions Paul will have primed us with. But some of us will bundle up and we'll go for a walk. We'll do the architecture parade. And the idea that Paul had, which I think is a great one, is so many of us travel with these cameras and phones and camera phones and whatnot. So he's going to provide some prompts, encourage us to take pictures of things, and then through the magic of hashtags, you could put those on social media, and if you do hashtag SI658, we will quickly be able to reconvene in here and look at those and talk about them. Presumably there's a reason one of you put them out there that way. And then there's also an ability to put them into a folder on the Canvas site, and I believe that that capability is going to be developed while we do the first part. Yeah. So any questions about the cavalcade of excellence for today? Okay, great. Let's get started then. And thank you, by the way, all of that great work that you guys did in the last part of class last week. I received scans of those, and I enjoyed reviewing those very much. All of you, and those of you who couldn't be here because of career day, that's fine. This isn't like a zero-sum game. Those weren't points that you should have had. They're just points. And as you may recall, we have this idea of participation registering in a way in this course. And so those of you who were here last week and you put your names on those pieces of paper, you get a dot next to your name. And by the time that we're done, those of you who didn't get all of those participation points in one fell swoop on World IA Day, which is February 24. There are 60 or so of those all over the world. You can go to whichever ones you want. Somebody's going to go to New York, which sounds amazing to me. They're going to have a great event, I'm sure. You can get all those points on World IA Day, but if you choose not to go there, that's fine. Doing stuff like we did last week is how you start to accumulate those. So we'll just be listening, and part of the genius of the seating chart is it makes it possible for us to register your participation while you're in here. So thank you for enduring the seating chart. One of the things that some of you did last week was picking up on this tetrad analysis of Marshall McLuhan. And what's so fun about these is that there's no right way to do them. And it almost provides a mirror of the person who's filling it out, sort of to see who you are relative to this thing. And I thought it might be interesting to run this. Last week we talked with Mr. Wurman a bit. Information architecture being something that he really materialized as a thing in the world in 1976 at this conference. That's what that picture in the middle there is the advanced program for this conference. I had the idea of running this analysis on Wurman-style information architecture. What kind of a medium is it, and how might we use this analysis to understand it? But yes, there's a question.
Can we minimize the camera?
Oh, yes. Yeah, we don't want to watch me the whole time. Thank you. There we go. Thank you. Okay. So as you may recall, this is a framework that McLuhan postulated that you can use to evaluate anything that is an extension of man. And even though Mr. Wurman disclaimed any intent to weaponize information architecture or any of the things that he was doing as something that would be helpful to other people, it has been helpful to me. And my sense is, had it been paid attention to more better during its time, it could have been awfully helpful to other people as well. So just by way of introduction for today and connecting information architecture to architecture, and especially this interesting tipping point in the world where information architecture is being presented in the context of architecture, right? This is a conference for people who make the built environment, not weirdos like us who make computer systems. What was this thing for? As I ran this analysis, the way that I decided to say it for today is this enhances the information carrying capacity of the built environment. What a wonderful thing to be able to do. As density in urban areas becomes more and more problematic, in the 1970s, as the energy crisis is gripping the United States and many places in the first world, the idea that we could make the environment, so what I said in the little type here is, utilizes relationships in space and time to encode and decode information with a focus on comparison and relative situatedness. So not a focus on things, but a focus on the relationship between things and how to make the built environment tell us more about itself and what we want to do with it. It clarifies, it complexifies, makes us able to deal with complexity better. McLuhan said that all media have this funny propensity to retrieve the effects of some prior medium. And in my way of working through this, what I'm saying information architecture retrieves is something called spatial primitives. The philosopher Alan Watts likes to talk about the two great symbolic fetishes, the round one and the long one. That there are shapes in space that we assign meaning to. So the round one and the long one being metaphors for reproductive parts, let's say. That there is something that we all understand very deeply about shapes in space and what they mean. And what I believe what Werman's sense of IA does is it's tapping into that sense of knowing that we have, that is a spatial way of knowing. Here I said the deep structure of space is covalent with whatever contextual meanings we're trying to do. So we try to make meaning out of situating things in space, increase the information carrying capacity of the environment. Awesome. But along with that, at the same time, there are meanings about how things exist in space that are affecting what we're doing. What does this obsolesce? What does it change the function of? My sense is that information architecture, if this were to be a thing, if what Werman was talking about in the late 70s were to be practiced in any significant way, that would obsolesce the role of high priests, the kinds of super experts who mediate our relationship with information by being the ones who advise us on and who help us purchase products and services. That the phrase "nobody ever got nobody ever got fired for hiring IBM," where there is some secret stuff that only a mediator, only a special guru could get you at. This is such a dumb conception as Werman wanted it to be. He didn't want anything, as he tells it. It's such a dumb conception that it would be accessible to anyone. So it's going to shift focus from expert mediation between users and products to organizing everyone's participation around performances. What do we want out of the urban environment, would be his question. This disintermediates and it democratizes, as I see it. And then if you do this wrong, if you were to become a maniac of this way of working and worked it too hard and took it too far, what would happen? My sense is that it would be like Excel. When distinctions and differentiations are subordinated to orderliness, and you lose the meaning of something being next to something. This is the world of it depends, which, dear children, that's the world that we are all living in, is where we don't want things to mean any particular thing, where this being next to that is only as meaningful as we need it for right now. And my sense is what Werman's, if this were a tool, if he cared about giving it to anyone, I'm just taking it anyway, that this is what this tool does for us. It creates these beautiful ways of making the distinctions and adjacencies of information or elements in space meaningful. And if we went too far with that, in our quest for orderliness, we could destroy the order. So that's my little playing with the tetrad. And please feel free to run this on any concepts you find in this class, and I'd love to see what you make of them. McLuhan referred to this way of analyzing as a probe. He wouldn't say that this is telling us the truth. He's saying this is a way that we could stick our finger in the beehive and see what's going on in there. Maybe. So, for what it's worth. Okay. All of you are encouraged to send me emails about things that happen in class, things that you like, things that you don't like. One of you bravely sent me some questions and some objections to some of the material from last week. And one of the questions was about the, what is the limit of this arrogant approach to making everything understandable? And this, if you're just dumb, you can figure things out. You don't have to care about saving the world. You can just figure things out. The Werman cockiness in IA. And it reminded me of a little piece of audio that I borrowed from an archive somewhere, and I won't wrap myself out. But I didn't have permission to extract it from this archive, but I did anyway. And so I'm just going to play this for you. Hopefully it'll work. The AV will work. But this is a recording, I think, from 1994 of Richard Saul Werman, and I think it's at the Aspen Design Conference. But talking about what is the limit of understanding, and I think I want to use this as a bridge between architecture and information architecture, and how far can somebody like me take this idea that what we do as information architects might be the same thing as what architects do. He had just gone to see something called the Bayeux Tapestry. This junket he was on with design fancy people had gone to England and then across to France to see, and they went to see this beautiful tapestry. And on the way, it just so happened to be some commemoration of the war in Normandy, and driving past the cemetery and seeing all of those stars, and he notes that he's Jewish, and he saw the stars and the crosses, and that he just wept because of how inadequate, as somebody, and he self-owns this. This is you're welcome to listen to this. If you put on headphones, you can actually hear it, and hear it's unintelligible. But he really drags himself over sort of the coals of, as the guy who goes around cockily saying, I know how to understand things, you just make, you equalize the scale and you put them next to, and you just be like, that absolutely, completely failed. And the word that he uses, which I'm fascinated by, as somebody who's really interested in embodiment and embodied cognition, is visceral understanding. What he said was, I became, and this is a paraphrase, became aware of the gap between what I thought I understood, having read all of the books, all of the histories of the war, seen all the movies, listened to all the things, right? He had relatives that died in the Holocaust. He thought he understood this, but being in his, and I'm gonna put words in his mouth, but I think it's the physical, his word, visceral understanding, that unless you are spatially co-present with the arrangement of things in space like this, there's something that you don't get. And that's why I think it is worthwhile for us to spend a little bit of time, like with an architect today, to look at the built environment. And you are welcome to think of this as purely an analogy. But my gosh, I will bring in a VR headset. Who here has been in there, like with had your visual sense at least completely taken over? Hands up higher so I can see them. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. 15 or 16 of us out of, I don't know how many are here today. That visceral understanding, somebody can be watching what you are doing in there on the screen, right? It's a feed from what is going into your eye holes. But there's something else going on there, and I think it's about this visceral understanding. And one of the, I think, opportunities that we have as information architects, and Richard's experience as a user of information, to understand something important to culture, to everyday life, like a massive world war, a slaughter on a scale that we can't understand. He hit the limit of that as somebody who's an expert with these things. These things, you couldn't shake one of these and get the visceral understanding out of it, is my sense. But in there, I don't know. And so I think that's part of what animates somebody like Molly Wright-Steenson, someone like myself, into this wanting to have architecture and what we make in digital talking to each other, rubbing up against each other, is the sense of we are maybe on the cusp of surmounting the limits of what had come, where we've been with information architecture. What happens when this spatial aspect really starts to hit us in digital? It's terrifying. It's that terror and confidence thing that Richard uses every day. I think that's my attitude toward this, is terror and confidence that we could maybe get there. There is a lot that's been said about architecture. I've culled some quotes about it that help make this case about why this relates to the things that people like us who connect people and information through technology, why would architecture matter to us? He's talking about architecture in the built environment here, but I would like to extend this to the types of things that we do. That architecture, in combining form and space into a single essence, not only facilitates purpose, but communicates meaning. The art of architecture makes our existence not only visible, but meaningful. And I think this is something that we're going to dig into on our architecture parade, is what does the built environment mean? Sure, it's providing shelter. It's providing the university with a way to bill you all and students who live here lots of money every month to keep a roof over their heads, put food in their faces. But what does this stuff mean? What is it trying to do? Or in Molly's, I love the way that she asks it, what is the verb? What are we doing in claiming to do architecture? What is that verb? And how is it different than design? She says the way designers and programmers use the term speaks to the idea of what an architect does, to the complexity of their work, and to the expertise that architects claim. In effect, they architect architectures. And the first time that I saw her give a talk was at the O'Reilly Design Conference. And she said, she noted, and I think Paul, we could ask him if this is true, but I would suspect it's true. Architects don't like that word. They don't say it. What architects say is that they design things. It's we who are not in the built environment architecture, we who are not landscape architects, but who want to use that word. I think these are some of the reasons we want to use the word. We want people to think about complexity. We want people to pay us more. Architect sounds like it costs more than designers, at least in some parts of the world. But what is that thing that we're doing? You can know somebody isn't an architect maybe if they use the word architected. There is a chap named Dan Ramsden. We're going to talk with some people from his team, the Voice UI team from BBC, in a couple of weeks. This guy is their boss, and I love what he says here. Architecting is not a nice word if it's onomatopoetic. Do you know what that means? Onomatopoeia? When the word sounds like what it means. And I love this. So he says, if this word is, it's not a nice word, and if this is an onomatopoeia, it suggests a rugged, jagged back and forth that's not always helpful. That the way it doesn't really come out, it feels funny when you say it. He's saying that's another reason to keep embracing this word is the process is funny. The process isn't comfortable. And so to use this arcane verb of architecting, maybe that is all the more reason why we ought to be using it, to the extent that we are in the painful, stuttery part of the process, which my experience of selling IA consulting, that is exactly what it feels like almost all the time. is it helpful or not, back and forth. Driven by interrogating difference and asking the difficult question. Going backward from the problem statement, which nobody wants to do. That's that back and forth. Werman's sense of the pervasive seduction to designers to go and solve a problem without asking about telling the truth. This architecting is going backward sometimes when everybody else wants to go forward, asking the difficult question. The hardening of the CH sound has a little brutality to it. I don't like it as a word, but I struggle to find another that I like more to describe what I do, is what this Dan says. And I am almost always in agreement with Dan's generally, and this one in particular. I don't think you have to believe this statement that architecture is not the same as design. But the distinction that I like to make, and it's one that if you read the Lou Kahn chapter, and apologize for the typos and whatnot in that, I was involved in helping Mr. Werman in a small way make this book, this 7-pound book that I complained about carrying last time. The chapter that I gave you was a proof, and there were typos that got corrected from there. But Lou Kahn's sense of architecture and information architecture coming from Werman, who is such a devotee of Kahn, that architecture is not the same thing as design. And the main difference being about problem solving. It's funny, the two people who never fired Richard from a job, Charles Eames and Lou Kahn. And to my reading of their work, couldn't have more difference in their sensibilities about what design is. Charles Eames was also trained as an architect of buildings. Ray was trained as a designer. But their sense is problem solving. And in that Lou Kahn reading, there's that beautiful line of need in architecture is a ham sandwich. Like, of course you need something, but he didn't want to talk about what you need. He wanted to talk about what you desire. Is there something bigger than what you are after in the immediate moment? Could we go backward from your problem? That's the Lou Kahn way. Charles and Ray Eames, there's a quote that I love from them, which is, don't give us that good design bullshit. Does it solve a problem? The thing that you're doing, is it serviceable? Is it better? And my God, the problem of airport seating, either the power of their brand and Herman Miller's brand is so strong that people keep reifying a bad solution, but I don't think so. The Eames airport seating, I've seen it in the parts of the world I've been, not all around it, but I've been around a lot of airports. And man, that is a better way to do seating than what had come before. And it's serviceable. There's 30, 40-year-old versions of this that are still being repaired because it solves the problem so well. And the sense that architecture is more than solving problems. We'll get into Chris Alexander in the second part of the course. In Molly's book, she says it a couple of times, takes note of how he is not liked. Reviled is a word that is used to describe architects in particular attitude toward Christopher Alexander for saying stuff like this, that the kind of order that architects want to and do make is prior to function, that it is not starting with solving a problem, and that Kahn and Alexander both attained to say that what they were trying to do was make it be good, not look good. In that Kahn reading, how many times was the word truth in that reading? There is a belief in some quarters, and those are the ones I happen to be very interested in because they've affected Richard so directly, of the idea that architecture is not problem solving, it is prior to function. It absolutely has to incorporate function, but we're doing something beyond function. Piazza San Marco from the reading, and I apologize for the vulgarity. I'm nothing and I'm beautiful as shit. This huge space, it's the picture on the back of this book, a picture he took at Piazza San Marco in Venice. it means something for that much land that is so hard to hold, and to erect this beautiful city in a swamp miles from the shore, the Doge Palace and the epicenter of power, and the discipline to leave that much space open, and what that means for, what does that mean? I think Richard and other architects of this ilk would say that's the power of architecture. This is not solving a problem. This is creating problems, perhaps, at least contributing to complexity in the built environment. In tech, I like how sometimes we use architecture. There was a kerfuffle about security with messaging platforms, and this quote from someone from Apple: iMessage is not architected to allow Apple to read messages, said Apple spokeswoman Trudy Miller. So this idea that architecture, this setup governs what can and cannot happen. It is not isomorphic to a problem. It is an environment that is encompassing all sorts of complexity, and it ends up having the effect of governing what is more and less likely to happen, or in some cases, what can and cannot happen. And with this statement, I'm curious, would it be any more or less powerful if we said iMessage is not designed to allow Apple to read messages? What's the difference if we use the verb design here? Does anybody think there's synonyms? Doesn't affect the heft of that statement? Seen some head nods that it might affect the heft. Yeah, my sense is this is an appeal to the authority, like we saw in the earlier quote, and also to say that if they said designed, well, then you could redesign it. Somebody else could make a design intervention that could let you read the messages. This is saying it's architected. This is saying this whole world is set up in a way that some things are going to happen and some things aren't going to happen. You're not going to design your way into reading these messages. It just can't happen because of how it was architected. I encourage you, if you'd not seen the film, which is a very long film, to at least take a look at this opening section. And I apologize for how violent it is. Anybody seen this, The Dawn of Man passage from Kubrick in other, is anybody in other classroom settings? Either why did you talk about this in another class, or why would this be relevant to anything that we've talked about so far? I'm curious.
So there's a Stanley Kubrick film called The Dawn of Man. I'm wondering if you...
That's 2001, and this first section is The Dawn of Man. And I've seen it used in classes in a lot of different ways. So I'm curious, either if somebody had this, you were made to watch these human, ape, who knows what stage in the evolutionary chain, if that's even to watch this sequence, and that it tells us something about where mankind came from, and this shape, this monolith having something to do with it. Yes?
I watched it because in English class, one for like the Bible class, another for like the sci-fi.
So Bible is lit and sci-fi, origins of humanity as the topics in English classes. And what was did they provide an interpretation of this? Not really. Other folks get an interpretation of this odd sequence? The way that I have come to understand it is that it is suggesting in the run of the story, what it's saying is that extraterrestrials caused the change in evolutionary development that was happening on the Earth from one of animals living in an animalistic way, that something fundamental changed to make human beings be so different if you believe humans are so different from the rest of the living things on the planet. And the theory in the story is that extraterrestrials were able to affect this change in human development to basically cause the evolution of mankind out of the ape-like beings through the introduction of the perfect rectangle. That the orthogonal quality of that perfect straight shape, perfectly smooth on a landscape that is nothing like this in the natural environment can ever exist, this kind of perfection. And the argument in the story is that this is how mankind was created, and that the same alien influence, it has an ongoing agenda for us. So it's an interesting, very, very long film. But this, at a minimum, what I like this for is the way that it makes the argument that our encounter with a shape in space can change us fundamentally. And the change that this introduced was not a nice one. That the one group of primates who were exposed to this concept of otherworldly perfection were able to extrapolate from that to using violence to kill other creatures. That they had been, they worked out their arguments before with lots of signaling and noise, but that they wouldn't murder until they were influenced by this otherworldly perfection. I'm not sure that I would want to take it that far, but it's an interesting concept, and I think it is, believe it or not, I think this is very relevant to what we do as people who choose to put shapes in space, as people who make interfaces, as people who arrange information. And it's writ large. I think what we're going to see, hopefully today, is the way that this shape in space affecting us, shaping what we do. There are ways that Paul, an expert, can walk around a built environment like this and teach us about what it's supposed to, how we're supposed to behave, or how it's supposed to be shaping the environment. One thing that I've come to suspect, I don't know this for sure, but both of these buildings were built by Robert Stern. And my sense is that the way of life here in North Quad, with the weird mashup of residential and food and graduate studies and institutes and just the craziness, they wanted these shapes in space to look the same. There was something trying to be accomplished at the level of what you could see from the helicopter. And what follows from that are all sorts of changes in how we are able to learn, how the environment here is shaped as being driven by some kind of weird meaning that is not sort of dropped on the corner here, and you're supposed to encounter this some way. So I'm curious to see what Paul could tell us about our building, whether or not it's a function of just needing to be similar to something else on campus. Part of the fun here is, just like those McLuhan tetrads, it's really hard to say what is a correct interpretation of this stuff. And there was an idea that was introduced to architecture in the Western tradition as far back as the turn of the BCE CE seam in time of Vitruvius. Robert Venturi, who designed he and his partner, Denise Scott Brown, designed Palmer Commons, which is a building here on campus you might know. He talks about how this introduction of an idea about architecture by Vitruvius back in the 1st century is part of what causes architecture to be such a confusing, and in some ways he delights in the confusion, such a confusing thing to talk about and to do right. The Vitruvian recipe for what architecture, what's the difference between architecture and a building? The Vitruvian formula is that architecture needs to have these 3 elements: firmness, commodity, and delight. And Leonardo da Vinci's famous drawing of the Vitruvian Man, that this is believed to be the correct way to apportion space for people is by grappling with this triad, these three problems of, does it stand up to the forces in the environment? Does it function? That's how some of us interpret commodity. And then the third element, being co-equal to how some of us read this, does it generate, is the result of this something beautiful or delightful? And Venturi's critique of modern architecture, especially modernist architecture, represented by Walter Gropius down there, is the idea of functionalism, that if it holds up, if it stands up to gravity and it does its job, that results in delight, that results in beauty. And that is the counter argument to Louis Kahn and Richard Werman, that architecture is not about problem solving. There is a way in modern architecture and forward of equating function with beauty, equating function with delight. One of the sidebars from the reading from the Understanding book was about Louis Sullivan. How many of you have heard the phrase form follows function? Most of us. I love, it's so strange to me, it's just like John 3:16 is the Bible verse that gets perseverated on. What about John 3:17? Here, the phrase that precedes the famous one is the interesting one to me. In 1896, architect Louis Sullivan wrote, "It is the pervading law of all things organic and inorganic, of all things physical and metaphysical, of all things human and all things superhuman, of all true manifestations of the head, of the heart, of the soul, that the life is recognizable in its expression, that form ever follows function." This is the law. Why we didn't focus on that the life is recognizable in its expression, what we've been focusing on in modern architecture forward especially, is the functional part of this. Another thing that Lou Kahn is famous for having said, he talks about it in the passage that you were asked to read for today, is talking about wonder. Wonder is a pretty squishy word. I found this passage in a reading about phenomenology, which is studying the effects of architecture and the body in this case. And Lou Kahn saying, keeping wonder in the focus of an architect. I love this. Wonder from the Old English wunder might be cognate with the German wood or wound. It would thus suggest a breach in the membrane of awareness, a sudden opening in a man's system of established and expected meanings, a blow as if one were struck or stunned. To be wonderstruck is to be wounded by the sword of the strange event, to be stabbed awake by the striking. That is something that architecture can attain to. A sense of wonder that goes beyond, wow, isn't that neat, into a sense of wounding or a confrontation. We'll skip that one for now. An example of this in Spain by Rafael Moneo. If anybody's been to Our Lady of the Angels Cathedral in Los Angeles, Moneo did that one as well. This is a town hall with an arcade made of columns that are too skinny, with a roof that is too high to provide any shelter or shade. This is an act of architecture which is making a comment about the function of government in the civil arena in Spain in 1974. That it's an artifice, that it's a structure in the built environment that is fancy and costs money, that you even maybe get a foreign star architect to help design, but it doesn't offer you comfort. In fact, it exacerbates the discomfort of living in this place at this time. This is the building that Peter Eisenman brought up. We'll look at this debate later in the class. In a debate about architecture, Eisenman said he loves it that architecture can do this. And Chris Alexander said, that's terrible, you're fucking up the world. And I think the answer to that is yes. And are there choices that we could make, that we could get fired for, let's say, about how we would set something up to say something about the client environment, to say something about the user relationship to the product and service, and to not just have that be greasing the skids of does it function and is it going to hold up? That you can be engaging in meaning, sometimes not in a pleasant way, sometimes not in a helping people in the immediate comfort kind of way. And what Richard said about doing this with information, I believe, is also true about doing it with travertine marble. The creative organization of material and space creates new information. There is new information created by this act of architecture. Venturi and Scott Brown provide a neato way to think about structures and how they speak. I'll be curious if there are, anyone would say that on the architecture walk that we engage in a couple of minutes here, that there are any of these, and Paul just walked past. Venturi and Scott Brown would say that a structure whose purpose is unmissably wedded to its shape is a duck, such as this duck-shaped building selling ducks. And that the opposite of that is a decorated shed, that you would have a more general use building and you decorate it, like this one has a fancy cladding on it to make it shiny and some paint. And that those are two ways of characterizing approaches to architecture. Either you are trying to have the architecture say something. So in this analysis, you might say that that City Hall by Manea was a duck. It's not just an undifferentiated box with some decoration on it. The structure was shaped in ways that say something. It's really hard to make this distinction, though. This is the Howard Miller Clock Company headquarters near where I live in Zeeland, Michigan. It looks like a decorated shed from the road. This is another view from the road, 2 big blocks. Okay. This is the entrance off to the side. And when you remember that they are a clock making company, then all of a sudden the sense is, well, what is this? Is this a building that has the product that the company is known for changing what the shape of the building is? Or is this a box that can be used for any number of things? I think the answer in this case is it depends. And even the 2 shapes, 2 blocks, and the name being in 2 pieces. What the thing that architecture in the built environment has, I think, the best shot at arguably being the same with information architecture is in terms of relationship. That the thing that it is obsessing about is more about relationships than things. This has been observed variously. Jorge Arango, who is an information architect, notes that your restaurant is among the latest manifestations of the eating place that we've been building for centuries, and that there is a relationship among the elements that we understand, and that it's the relationship that we are looking for as much as the elements themselves, which in the case of dining, we all know what this means, right? Means you're done. When you put your fork and you put the utensils on the plate, one argument would be that that is part of this set of relationships that is being architected. You can design a fork with 3 tines, 4 tines, 1 tine. You could have a spork. You can have all sorts of different designs to the plate and the fork and the knife, but it's the relationships that are part of the architecture of the eating place. And one little bit of fact about the place setting that I think is fascinating. In the interwar period in Europe, after World War I, the arrangement of the utensils on the tabletop was changed. Because French and Germans would be dining with one another, and after having spent so much time killing each other so shortly, So recently, the idea of having the knife on the right hand in the dominant hand when opponents are now at peace and dining together was too threatening. And so table manners were changed to put the knife on the left side and the non-dominant hand in the interwar period as part of the evolution of this architecture of what is a dining place. Kind of interesting. Andrea Resmini, who's somebody that will have as a guest in a couple of weeks, is going to come visit us. He notes that we have something akin to those relationships in space that we know about for the eating place. We also have that for the medium of film. But sadly, and for sure we have that for buildings, but information environments are so new that we don't yet have those patterns established that we can really lean on. For example, left and right. What is on the sidebar? What is in the left rail? What does it mean for something to be in the left rail? In early versions of Facebook, it was all of the my things over there on the left. My profile, my friends, my photos, my shares. Evolutionary step. They then made the left, when that didn't work, they made the left rail be generic to the Facebook, not to you. So not my profile, my friends, my shares, but photos, notes, groups, more about us than about me. And they've even played with some views that don't have a left rail at all. And who knows, right? There's probably an algorithm trying out these combinations endlessly to figure out what is the pattern that leads to the outcome that we're looking for. My Sky Miles, I often think about that place setting and, you know, is that left rail, is that left rail the thing that you hold down and then, I don't know. But there's something about these spatial relationships in these two-dimensional interfaces that I think we benefit from paying attention to. What does that mean? What do the meatballs mean? Anyone? You've seen these, right? More. What else does it mean? Does it have other meanings? What's that? Yeah, it's an ellipse, dot, dot, dot. How about the hamburger in the middle?
Hidden functionality.
Ooh, I like that. Hidden functionality. Didn't it used to mean menu?
Yeah.
If you use the most recent version of Google Calendar, it just means hidden functionality. It means hide and show the left rail where there are other things going on. What about meatballs or that's shish kebabs? What is that? Right? Like we are part list. Yeah, so there is something that we're doing, trying to find the forms for what we are trying to do. Some of this is just problem solving. But what I'm hoping that we learn as we look at what architects are doing in the built environment is this idea of what's going on here beyond solving a problem. What is this starting to mean? And are the meanings that are happening in space and because of the relationships of things in space aligned with what I'm trying to accomplish? Lou Kahn believed that there is a deep well of agreement behind the making, that when you make something, when you architect something and it's good, that what you're tapping into is something that is transpersonal, something that goes beyond culture, that there is a deep place of agreement that you can tap into, and that's something that architects are grappling with. The yardstick that they're holding up to themselves, have I tapped into something more than the immediate context? I love it how he says it here.
Now a plan, as against a room, is a society of rooms. The rooms must talk to each other. How must the plan, society of rooms talking to rooms, can become alive if you make that which is a good place to live in, a good place to sleep in, a good place to study in, A house is only great when it's great for the next man, not only the client who wasn't just so. Therefore, early in my considerations of things, I said that the greatest act in building a house is to build a house, not a house, which is specific. And of course, it's what you build. But a house is what you consider when you build a house. And you can never build a home because the home is made by the people.
The greatest thing that you could build is house, not a house for the client that wants everything to be just so, but that you could be doing something bigger than that. As he said, that it's great for the next occupant, the next man, not just the immediate client who needs everything to be just so. Try telling that to the immediate client though. They don't want to hear that. Great. So next week, we are going to start learning how to model a lot of what I talked about today, and some of what we'll see in our walk around the block is the relationships of things to one another. There is this marvelous, very dumb way of describing relationships, modeling relationships that we will learn next week. And modeling, it's great. And so then for the next hour, why don't we take a break, come back when the big hand is on the 3, and then Paul Daniels, who is sitting in the corner of the room back there, he might have a couple of things to say, and then we'll go for a walk. So see you back here in 10 minutes.
Create a segment. If you go to Canvas and understand, you see it.
Awesome.
Yeah.